Streaming feels inevitable today. You open an app, you press play, and a movie starts instantly. No discs, no downloads, no waiting. It feels so natural that most people assume it had to happen this way, as if streaming were simply the unavoidable result of faster internet and better computers. But that assumption is wrong, because streaming didn't suddenly appear in the 2000s, it wasn't born with Netflix, it wasn't invented by YouTube, and it certainly wasn't a happy accident of broadband. Streaming was built years earlier by people who saw the future too soon and paid the price for it. And at the center of this story is a man most people have never heard of, not because his idea failed, but because it worked. Before we go any further, if you enjoy deep dives into forgotten inventors, buried technologies, and the quiet wars fought behind patents and corporate doors, subscribe to the channel now. And keep this question in mind as you listen, because I want your answer later in the comments. Do you think technology evolves naturally, or only when powerful institutions decide it's safe to let it evolve? To understand this story, we need to go back to the early 1990s, when the internet wasn't entertainment, it wasn't culture, and it wasn't a place people lived in every day. It was infrastructure. Most people didn't even know it existed, and those who did accessed it through dial-up modems, listening to that familiar screech as their computers struggled to send data over phone lines that were never designed for video. Websites were static, images loaded painfully slow, audio itself felt advanced, and video was considered absurd. The dominant belief at the time was simple: video belonged on television, computers were for documents, and the two worlds were never supposed to meet. Almost everyone believed that, except a small group of engineers who were asking a question that sounded insane at the time. What if video didn't need to be downloaded first? What if it could be played while it was still being transmitted? Today that sounds obvious, but in the early 90s it bordered on technological heresy. Video files were huge, networks were slow, and computers barely had the power to decode moving images in real time. The idea that you could click a button and immediately watch something happen on a computer screen felt unrealistic, irresponsible, and commercially pointless. One of the people who refused to accept that logic was an engineer named Rob Glaser. Glaser wasn't trying to disrupt Hollywood, and he wasn't dreaming about binge-watching or global platforms. He was obsessed with a much simpler idea: media was just data, and data could move. In 1993, he founded a company called Progressive Networks, a name that quietly revealed his mindset. This wasn't about waiting for perfect conditions, it was about making imperfect systems work now and letting them evolve over time. The core concept behind Progressive Networks was radical in its simplicity. Instead of forcing users to download an entire audio or video file before playback, the system would send small chunks of data continuously, allowing playback to begin almost immediately. Today we call that streaming. Back then, there wasn't even a proper word for it. What Progressive Networks built wasn't theoretical. It wasn't locked inside a lab. It was released into the world. In 1995, the company launched Real Audio, one of the first widely available streaming audio formats. Shortly after came Real Video. The quality was rough, the image was grainy, the audio sometimes lagged, but it worked. People could click a link and listen to live radio broadcasts over the internet. They could watch short video clips without waiting for the entire file to download. For the first time, media wasn't something you owned physically, it was something you accessed instantly. This was a quiet revolution, and at first, many companies didn't know how to react. Some were impressed but dismissive. They said the internet was a niche, they said consumers wouldn't tolerate low-quality video, they said bandwidth would always be a limitation. And in the short term, they weren't entirely wrong. But they missed the larger pattern that repeats throughout the history of technology: bandwidth increases, hardware improves, costs fall, and ideas that once seemed ridiculous slowly become inevitable. As Progressive Networks, now renamed RealNetworks, continued to grow, the company did what inventors are always told to do. They filed patents. Not just on compression techniques, but on the methods of delivering audio and video over a network in real time, including buffering, playback, and synchronization. These weren't flashy patents, and they didn't sound revolutionary to non-engineers, but they described something profoundly threatening to existing power structures. A future where media wasn't tied to physical objects, where distribution didn't require trucks, shelves, or schedules, and where access mattered more than ownership. At first, the industry tried to ignore it. But once RealNetworks software began shipping with millions of computers and their formats became de facto standards, ignoring streaming was no longer an option. And that's when curiosity turned into concern. Because streaming didn't just offer a new way to consume media, it threatened the entire system that controlled how media was distributed, licensed, and monetized. Cable companies worried about competition, broadcasters worried about relevance, and telecom companies worried about bandwidth usage. Streaming wasn't just a technical challenge, it was a structural one. What followed wasn't an open war, at least not yet. It was quieter than that. Licensing disputes, closed-door negotiations, partnerships that felt less like collaboration and more like containment. Streaming was allowed to exist, but only in limited forms, under strict conditions, and often stripped of its most disruptive potential. Live streaming was constrained, high-quality video was discouraged, and the idea of massive on-demand libraries was treated as unrealistic, even irresponsible. The message was subtle but clear: this technology can exist, just not like that. And this is the moment where I want you to pause for a second. Because this pattern appears again and again in the history of innovation. Not through outright bans or censorship, but through permission structures that decide when an idea is allowed to reach its full potential. If you're enjoying this story so far, like the video and let me know in the comments if you had ever heard about RealNetworks or early streaming before this. Most people haven't, and that silence tells us a lot. By the late 1990s, RealNetworks had proven that streaming was technically viable, but viability wasn't enough. The dot-com boom shifted attention toward websites, advertising, and e-commerce, and streaming was labeled expensive, risky, and difficult to monetize. Slowly, the momentum faded. Not because the idea was wrong, but because the ecosystem wasn't ready to let it win. Streaming retreated into niches like corporate training, news clips, and low-quality webcasts. The dream of instant, high-quality, on-demand entertainment wasn't killed, it was postponed. And that's the most important detail. When streaming finally returned years later, it didn't come back as a revolution. It came back as a product, polished, rebranded, and detached from its origins. The same ideas that once seemed impractical suddenly became billion-dollar businesses. And the man who helped invent it faded into the background. In the next part, we're going to follow what happened after the dot-com crash, how streaming quietly survived in the shadows, how the same concepts were reborn under new names, and how history was rewritten in the process. And we'll ask the question no one likes to answer: did streaming really fail in the 1990s, or was it simply not allowed to succeed yet? When people talk about failed technologies, they usually imagine something broken, impractical, or poorly executed. A bad idea that simply couldn't survive contact with reality. But streaming didn't fail like that. Streaming worked. That was the problem. By the late 1990s, RealNetworks had proven beyond any reasonable doubt that audio and video could be delivered over the internet in real time. Not perfectly, not beautifully, but reliably enough to change behavior. People were listening to live radio online. News organizations were posting video clips. Companies were experimenting with internal broadcasts. The genie was out of the bottle, and everyone in the industry could see where this was heading. Which is exactly why the pressure began to intensify. At first, the resistance was subtle. Executives didn't say, "This will never work anymore." Instead, they said things like, "This isn't scalable," or "Consumers aren't ready," or "The infrastructure isn't mature enough." These statements sounded reasonable, even responsible. But behind them was a deeper fear. Because if streaming succeeded too early, it would destroy business models that were still generating enormous profits. Cable subscriptions, broadcast advertising, physical media sales, regional licensing agreements, all of it depended on scarcity and control. Streaming didn't just challenge those systems. It made them obsolete. RealNetworks found itself in an uncomfortable position. They were too early to dominate the future, but too visible to be ignored. Their software was installed on millions of computers. Their codecs were widely adopted. Their patents covered key mechanisms of streaming delivery. They weren't just inventors anymore. They were a gatekeeper. And gatekeepers attract attention. This is where the story stops being about engineering and starts being about power. Because once streaming was recognized as inevitable, the question was no longer whether it would exist, but who would control it and when. Telecom companies were worried about bandwidth consumption. Streaming video threatened to overload networks that had been designed primarily for voice and light data. Media conglomerates were worried about losing their grip on distribution. Studios feared piracy, loss of licensing leverage, and the collapse of release windows. Even software giants began to take notice, seeing streaming as both an opportunity and a threat. What followed wasn't a single coordinated attack, but a convergence of interests. Licensing negotiations became more aggressive. Partnerships came with strings attached. Access to content was restricted. RealNetworks was pushed into a defensive posture, spending more time negotiating permissions than innovating. Streaming was allowed, but only within narrow boundaries. Low resolution. Limited duration. Specific use cases. Anything that looked too close to replacing television was quietly discouraged. And here's the crucial part that rarely gets discussed. Patents, which are supposed to protect inventors, can also trap them. RealNetworks held important patents, but enforcing them required legal battles against companies with far more resources. At the same time, licensing those patents often meant compromising control. Either way, the inventor loses leverage. The system rewards whoever can afford to wait, litigate, and outlast. By the end of the 1990s, the dot-com bubble was reaching its peak. Investors were pouring money into websites, banner ads, and e-commerce platforms. Streaming, by contrast, looked expensive and slow to monetize. Bandwidth costs were high. Advertising models were unproven. Subscription services felt premature. As capital flowed elsewhere, enthusiasm for streaming cooled. Not because the technology had failed, but because it didn't fit the financial narratives of the moment. Then came the crash. When the dot-com bubble burst in the early 2000s, companies that weren't immediately profitable were punished hard. RealNetworks survived, but barely. Many experimental streaming initiatives were shut down. Investment dried up. The media industry breathed a quiet sigh of relief. The threat had been neutralized, at least for now. But streaming didn't disappear. It went underground. It survived in places most people didn't look. Corporate communications. Distance learning. Government briefings. Niche news outlets. Low-profile webcasts. The technology kept evolving quietly while public attention moved on. Codecs improved. Compression algorithms became more efficient. Buffering techniques got smarter. All the unglamorous work that turns a radical idea into reliable infrastructure continued, just without headlines. And this is where history starts to get rewritten. Because when people later looked back at the early 2000s, they didn't see streaming as a suppressed revolution. They saw it as a failed experiment that simply needed better conditions. They forgot, or were never told, how close it had already come. They assumed that streaming only became possible once broadband arrived, once computers got faster, once the market matured. They assumed the idea had been waiting patiently for the right moment. But ideas don't wait. They're pushed aside. And this is a pattern worth paying attention to. If you're finding this story interesting, pause for a second and subscribe to the channel, because this exact dynamic shows up again and again in the history of technology. And while you're at it, leave a comment answering this question: do you think RealNetworks could have become the Netflix of the world if circumstances had been different, or was the system always stacked against them? By the mid-2000s, something curious began to happen. The same companies that once dismissed streaming as impractical started revisiting it. Broadband adoption was increasing. Home connections were faster and more stable. Storage costs were dropping. Suddenly, the obstacles that had been cited as deal breakers were being reframed as temporary inconveniences that had now been solved. But the way streaming returned was different. It didn't come back as a challenge to the system. It came back as an extension of it. Instead of open platforms, services were siloed. Instead of universal access, content was locked behind subscriptions and regional restrictions. Instead of questioning the old distribution model, streaming was used to reinforce it, just in a more efficient form. The revolutionary potential was still there, but it was carefully contained. And the names attached to this new era of streaming weren't the ones who had pioneered it. RealNetworks was still around, still innovating, still holding patents, but they were no longer shaping the narrative. New players entered the scene with fresh branding, cleaner interfaces, and better timing. They weren't burdened by the history of early resistance. They weren't associated with failure. They were framed as visionaries, even though the core ideas they were using were over a decade old. This is the moment where the story becomes uncomfortable. Because it forces us to confront a hard truth about innovation. Being first doesn't mean you win. Being right doesn't mean you succeed. And inventing something doesn't guarantee you'll be remembered for it. In many cases, it just means you absorb the cost of proving an idea works, while someone else benefits when the environment becomes favorable. RealNetworks didn't just invent streaming. They proved it was possible. They normalized it. They trained users to expect instant playback. They solved problems that later companies would never have to think about. And then they were pushed aside when the rewards finally arrived. By the time streaming re-entered public consciousness in a big way, the groundwork had already been laid. The risks had already been explored. The failures had already happened. The dangerous part was over. And that's when it became safe. In the next part, we're going to look at what happened when streaming finally exploded into the mainstream, how companies like Netflix and YouTube reframed an old idea as a new invention, and why the original pioneers were almost completely erased from the story. And we'll end with a question that goes far beyond streaming itself. If innovation can be delayed, redirected, and rewritten like this, how many other, future technologies, are already here, quietly waiting for permission? By the late 2000s, something strange happened. Streaming didn't feel radical anymore. It felt obvious. Internet connections were faster, computers were more powerful, and suddenly the idea of watching video online no longer sounded like science fiction. It sounded like convenience. And that's exactly when the story was rewritten. Not with lies, but with omission. The narrative quietly shifted from, "this was impossible," to, "this was inevitable," and in that transition, the pioneers disappeared. When YouTube launched in 2005, it was framed as a breakthrough, a revolutionary way for anyone to upload and watch video online. And in many ways, it was. The interface was simple, the buffering was tolerable, and the social element changed how people interacted with media. But the core concept wasn't new. Playing video before it fully downloads, adaptive buffering, real-time playback over imperfect networks, all of that had already been solved years earlier. The hard problems weren't being solved for the first time. They were being reused, refined, and scaled. Netflix followed a similar path. When it shifted from DVDs to streaming in the late 2000s, it was hailed as visionary. And again, the business execution was brilliant. But technologically, Netflix wasn't inventing streaming from scratch. It was stepping into an ecosystem that already existed, one that had been stabilized by earlier failures, tested by earlier risks, and normalized by earlier companies. The difference wasn't imagination. It was timing. And timing, in the world of patents and power, is everything. Because by the time streaming re-emerged as a mainstream product, it was no longer a threat to the system. It fit neatly into existing structures. Studios could license content. Platforms could geo-fence regions. Subscriptions could replace cable bills. Streaming didn't destroy the old order. It absorbed it. And once that happened, the resistance vanished. The same industry that once treated streaming as dangerous now embraced it as inevitable progress. This is the part of the story that makes people uncomfortable. Because it suggests that innovation doesn't fail because it's bad, or premature, or misunderstood. Sometimes it fails because it arrives before it's convenient for those in control. And when that happens, the idea isn't killed outright. It's slowed down, boxed in, and quietly waited out until someone else can reintroduce it under safer conditions. RealNetworks didn't vanish. Rob Glaser didn't disappear. But their role in the story was minimized. They became early experiments, stepping stones, footnotes in a narrative that preferred clean success stories over messy truths. The patent system, which is supposed to reward inventors for taking risks, didn't protect them from being outpaced by larger forces with deeper pockets and better timing. Their reward wasn't dominance. It was invisibility. And this isn't unique to streaming. This pattern shows up again and again in technology. The first electric cars. Early social networks. Virtual reality. Artificial intelligence. Again and again, we see ideas appear, struggle, get dismissed, and then quietly return years later once the environment becomes friendly enough. The second wave gets the credit. The first wave absorbs the cost. So when we talk about innovation, we need to ask a harder question. Are we really watching progress unfold naturally, or are we watching a carefully managed release schedule? Are technologies emerging when they're invented, or when they're allowed? If you've made it this far, take a moment to like the video and subscribe to the channel, because stories like this don't get told often, and they matter more than we realize. And now I want you to answer this in the comments. Honestly, how many technologies do you think already exist today, working quietly in the background, but won't be allowed to change the world until it's profitable and controllable enough? Because the man who invented streaming in the 1990s didn't lose because he was wrong. He lost because he was early. And history doesn't reward the early. It rewards the ones who arrive when the system is ready to pretend it was their idea all along. Streaming didn't begin when you first pressed play on Netflix. It began years earlier, in a world that wasn't ready to accept what it meant. And the real war wasn't about technology. It was about timing, control, and who gets remembered when the future finally becomes safe. This was patent wars.